Ladies and gentlemen, if you could please shift forward to make this panel more intimate. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our third annual State of Women in Engineering session. I'm Penny Wersing, the FY19 president of the Society of Women Engineers. As you probably know, SWE is a nonprofit diversity organization with more than 40,000 members and 500 sections around the world. It was founded almost 70 years ago, and our mission is to advance women in engineering and technology, and we have a lot of work to do. During this presentation, you will learn more about current research trends. First, we will hear from the SWE literature review authors who will frame the discussion and explain the current research landscape. Next, we'll find out about SWE's latest study on gender bias in the engineering workplace in India. Then, we'll find out about the experiences of women engineers who graduated from college in the 1970s, a study that involved a number of SWE members. And finally, we'll hear about sexual harassment of women in STEM academic settings. To begin our session, Peggy Lane, Assistant Provost for Faculty Development at Virginia Tech, will provide a brief overview of the current status of women's representation in engineering. And Peter Meiskens, Vice Provost for Academic Programs and Professor of Sociology at Cleveland State University, will follow with more about the state of women in engineering. Peggy?
Thank you, Penny. I'm going to get us started with some numbers. I don't know about you, but I'm an engineer, so I like to start with the numbers. What you can see here is a graph of the percent of engineering degrees awarded to women in the United States going back to 1955. You can see up until the middle 1970s, less than 2.5% of engineering degrees in the US were awarded to women. I started my engineering education in 1976. You can see that there was a tremendous increase in the percent of women earning engineering degrees from the mid-70s through to the mid-90s, before leveling off for the next few years. And that's really a result of a decline in the number of men earning engineering degrees. Since 2000, though, both the number and the percent of women and men earning engineering degrees has increased, with the percentage of bachelor's degrees going to women hovering around 18 to 22% for almost the last 20 years. What this graph is showing you is information from the American Society for Engineering Education. They collect data every year on engineering degrees awarded in the US and some Canadian institutions. And what we learned from this is that the preference of women for different disciplines of engineering varies widely. So the tallest bar over there on the far end of the graph shows you that almost half of the engineering degrees in environmental engineering are awarded to women. And over on the other end, you'll see mechanical and electrical engineering, where only about 14% of degrees go to women. So you may not know, but mechanical engineering has been the most popular engineering discipline in the US for the last several years. Last year, over 30,000 bachelor's degrees in mechanical engineering were awarded, but only less than 15% of those went to women. Whereas in environmental engineering, only about 1,300 degrees were awarded, and half of those went to women. So even though you can see that very low percentages of women earn degrees in electrical and mechanical engineering, those are still the disciplines with the largest numbers of women, just because those are the largest disciplines of engineering overall. We have made progress in the percentage of women on the faculty in engineering schools. 10 years ago, women were only 12% of engineering faculty. Today, they're almost 17%. And women are being hired at the assistant professor level at almost the same rate as they are earning PhD degrees in engineering. So in 2017, women earned 23.5% of the doctoral degrees in engineering, and 24% of assistant professors were female. This data is from the American Association of University Women's 2015 report called Solving the Equation, the Variables for Women and Women's Success in Engineering and Computing, with updated data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The top line shows you women in the biological sciences, which have increased from 28% up to more than half over the last 40 years. The next line, the gray line, shows you women in mathematical and computer science, which you can see had a growth spurt but have then declined to the same percentage today as they were in 1960. The orange line shows you women in chemical professions, and they've increased from only 8% to 38%. And down there at the bottom, the blue line is women in engineering. We've increased from 1% in 1960 to about 13% today. This shows you the percent of women in engineering, the circled bar, the short one, the short blue bar, compared with other scientific and technical professions. And it just gives you the message that women remain significantly underrepresented in engineering, even compared with other technical careers. With that context in mind, I'm going to turn the podium over to Professor Peter Makesons, who's going to tell you a little bit about what the current research tells us to attempt to explain the persistent underrepresentation of women in engineering.
Thanks. Thanks, Peggy. So I have a very brief amount of time to tell you about a very large amount of research. So I will talk quickly, and I won't give you chapter on verse on the various studies that I'll summarize for you. If you really want to look up the articles and the research pieces that we discuss, you can find those materials in the annual SWE Lit Review, which is available online, and there actually were some paper copies that were printed, so you might find one of those somewhere around. So our question, I mean, as Peggy's numbers show, is how come there hasn't been more progress than we've seen over the past 30 years. And the literature review is essentially an attempt to try to understand why that's the case. And Peggy and I and Casey Beddoes have been writing this now for 5 or 6 years. You'll see that the data that Peggy presented show that the numbers of women practicing in engineering have not caught up to the numbers of women studying engineering. But then in spite of that, the research that we reviewed this year, and this has been true most years, has tended to focus on supply side issues. Why are there so few women in engineering programs? And that's still an issue, obviously. It's still a minority situation. But for those of you out there who are researchers, it would be interesting to learn more about why the more women who study engineering don't work as engineers, or don't appear to be given those data. So in terms of the supply side questions that we see researchers being interested in, one question that they tend to begin with is at the very beginning of girls' academic careers, why don't girls get more interested in engineering as a career prior to arriving at a post-secondary institution? And in this year's literature, we saw some fairly familiar themes, one of which kind of revolved around the issue of persistent stereotypes. A study at the University of Illinois found that these stereotypes began as early as age 6. They found that girls in their study already by age 6 tended to associate games that required you to be smart with boys, and boys tended to regard being really smart, being a genius, being brilliant as being something boys were good at. And since you know probably from other literature that there's a tendency to associate being good at STEM with brilliance, this kind of stereotype may be feeding that perception. You gotta be a genius to be an engineer. If you're not a boy, you can't be a genius. That was kind of the subtext of that study. We also saw research which pointed to the influence of parents, not so much in terms of what they do, but in terms of what they do in terms of raising children, but that children tend to emulate their parents. Historically, both boys and girls tended to emulate their fathers. The research interestingly found that children now, both boys and girls, tend to emulate their mothers increasingly as well, right? Which is good news, and especially since girls now may be following female role models. But the study points out that in the absence of large numbers of female engineers, there aren't too many mothers who are engineers for those girls to follow. So their prediction is it'll take a while for the influence of parents to move in other directions. We also saw studies that saw that girls early on tend to see themselves as having less ability in STEM-related academic areas in spite of data that said the opposite. The girls don't believe it. Same thing with math. Girls are now increasingly testing as well or better than math in secondary schools and in elementary schools. But girls' attitude towards math was different than boys. They tended to see it as less valuable, and so were less likely to see it as something that they wanted to focus on in subsequent studies. We also saw research that looked at whether exposure to engineering is an important factor in girls' development of an interest in this, and the study actually found that the answer was no, that the difference between girls who had been and who had not been exposed to engineers wasn't significant. And the study speculated that maybe it's exposure to female engineers that's a more relevant issue. So there's lots of interesting questions there that I'm sure researchers will continue to pursue. In terms of what happens in college, the timer just went out, so I have unlimited time. Right? In terms of what happens in college, research that we read this year found that there continues to be a pervasive masculine culture in engineering programs, and that many female students find that off-putting. We also saw some research which found that women are much more likely than men to have a communal orientation in terms of their desire in choosing a career, and that they didn't perceive engineering as speaking to that communal orientation. This is a theme that's been repeated in multiple studies over the years, that somehow engineering needs to do a better job of persuading women that this is a way that you can make the world a better place and do the kinds of things that apparently young women are particularly concerned to do. Again, at the college level, there's a classic old article that Sally Hacker wrote, 30 years ago, arguing that the problem keeping women out of engineering was math. Right? That's clearly no longer the case if we assess that in terms of women's math scores, how many women complete calculus, how many women test well in math. But again, what we found this year was a study which showed that although women do well in math, as well or better than men, that women who are good in math don't choose engineering as exclusively as do men who are good in math. Women who are good in math are more likely to look at other occupations as well, which is perhaps explaining why some of those potentially engineering students are going elsewhere for women. So, real quick, since I'm probably running out of time, I can't tell, right? Once we get to the workplace, as I said earlier, we have less research than we do about what happens in schools, perhaps because it's harder to get at workplaces. But we did see some research this year which raised a variety of important questions. One recurring theme in the literature on engineering and women is the question of whether work-family balance is keeping women out or is pushing women out of engineering at some point down the line. And we found conflicting results about this year. One study by Mary Blairloy and Aaron Seck found that women engineers were balancing two rather intensive cultures, a culture of intensive mothering and a culture of devotion to the workplace, and that they did see some evidence that this was causing women rather than men to opt out at some point, which confirms some other studies we'd seen in the past. On the other hand, another study looked at whether having a strong family orientation was discouraging women from choosing engineering in the first place. So did women who say they really wanted to have a family avoid engineering for that reason? And the answer in that particular study was no, that there was no difference between women who had a strong family orientation and those who didn't in terms of their propensity to select engineering. So there's still some loose ends here that need to be sorted out. Relevant to the question I raised earlier about women's greater communal orientation, are women attracted to alternative engineering as opposed to conventional building cars kind of engineering? And the answer here was actually kind of ambiguous. There was an interesting study from Germany of a group of women who worked for an alternative energy company. And what they found was that the women who were engaged with this company busily tried really hard to not frame what they did as alternative. Right? They tried to present it as just regular engineering, right? And didn't kind of magnify the alternativeness or the communal orientation of the work. They wanted to fit in. So that kind of problematizes that argument about whether women are different in terms of what they're looking for in terms of a goal. Some really interesting research that we'll be discussing in this year's Lit Review, it's not in last year, so stay tuned, looks at how the recruitment process goes. Two studies, one of which looked at academic recruiting, found that women in academic interviews get asked more questions than do male applicants and have less time to talk. So those of you who are here on a job search, listen up, right? Apparently, this was really disadvantaging women in job interviews, at least in an academic setting. They don't have data about non-academic jobs, but I would be interested to know whether that's been your experience. They also did some studies of high-tech companies which were consciously trying to recruit women and went to recruiting fairs where they knew they could find women, and they found that these recruiting fairs were actually occasions on which male stereotypes got reproduced, that the interview teams tended to be gender balanced. There'd be men and women, but the woman was there as a support person, the man did the interviewing. Right? And they tended to talk about the social lives of engineers in a way that was much more likely to appeal to boys than to girls, keg parties. Things of that sort got featured, and that this was an unintentional signaling of the maleness of engineering culture, which disadvantaged women in the interview process. So last, we've all been hearing a great deal about the toxic masculinity issue and the chilly climate in engineering firms, especially in Silicon Valley and elsewhere. The literature is not yet caught up to that, although there's some material beginning to come out now that's beginning to try to describe this. We did read a really interesting study this year called Gender Fluid Geek Girls, which appeared in Engineering Studies. I highly recommend this to you, which basically documented a geek culture in a Silicon Valley firm, documented that the women who worked there felt they had to fit in, right, and found that women who identified as LGBTQ had way more luck doing it than did straight women, and also African American women. So there's obviously some complexities here, and gender complexities, not just sex complexities here that have to be negotiated. The last study, also by Dana Britton, who's at Rutgers, is a really interesting study which talked about how the experience of discrimination or the experience of hostility does not often translate to the perception that there's a systemic chilly climate. That a lot of women, when interviewed about their experiences, documented or described experiences of having been treated badly, right, but then denied that it was a system problem. It was an incident. Right? Not a structure. And her point is that just documenting that these problems exist is not the same thing as being able to change them. All right, so I see zeros, so I better stop. So I'd like now to introduce Roberta Rincon from the SWE Research Group, who is going to talk a little bit about the gender bias in India study in engineering. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. So I want to start off by talking a little bit, really focusing most of my presentation on the current research that SWE is undertaking. So as Peter kind of discussed some of these different areas of research, that's basically how I think about the research that SWE works on in 3 different areas. The first one being in the K-12 education space. And right now, I'm very excited to share with you that we have received a National Science Foundation grant to fund a collaborative research study with researchers out of the University of Texas at Austin to study the development of an engineering identity in high school girls. And we're going to be looking at and working with the high school girls that are part of our SWE Next member group. This is a free membership that's open to girls in grades K through 12. We're going to be surveying and interviewing high school girls over a 3-year period to understand the influence of peer and adults on their decisions to major in engineering in college. Because these are girls who have already indicated some level of interest by joining SWE Next. So understanding how the peer and adult influences are impacting their decisions to major in engineering after high school graduation could be really informative to the work that we do in the outreach and college space. The college space is the second area where we are trying to conduct some research studies. And we're in the planning stages right now for a second community college transfer study. Our first one, we presented the findings last year. And one of the really interesting findings from that study is that women tend to switch majors out of engineering at significantly higher rates than men do. So they're on this same pathway, and we know, based on data that we've collected in higher ed, that more women are graduating from college these days. More women are actually transferring from community college to 4-year institutions as well. But we're just not seeing that in the engineering majors. So this second phase will help us to understand how factors like motivation, self-confidence, self-efficacy are impacting their decisions to stay or leave engineering in college. We anticipate beginning our data collection in early 2019, and hopefully we'll have some findings to share at our next conference. The third space that we look at is the engineering workforce area, and we've done quite a bit of work in this area over the last 3 years. We had our culture study that we released in 2016. We've also done gender bias in the U.S. engineering workforce that we released last year, and a Women of Color in Early Career study that we conducted in collaboration with the National Society of Black Engineers. But today I want to tell you a little bit about our latest study, which was an examination of bias in the engineering workplace in India. We worked with researchers out of the Center for Work-Life Law to conduct this study. These are the same researchers that we worked with to do the gender and racial bias in the US workforce. And partnering with them to study engineers in India, we really wanted to focus on the 4 patterns of bias that Joan Williams has identified in her work in understanding bias in the workplace, and the effects of those biases on hiring, promotion, performance evaluations, compensation, and other workplace processes and outcomes. If you had the opportunity to listen to Dr. Rachel Korn's presentation earlier today, she explained in much greater depth and detail than I'll be able to do today about those 4 patterns of bias. If you missed that, I encourage you to visit the recording that we will have available on our website of her presentation to learn more. The survey that we released in India was completed by almost 700 engineers. 61% of them were women. And this is just showing you some of the statistics, descriptive statistics about the sample that we used for this particular study. So I'm going to explain some high-level findings associated with each of the 4 patterns of bias that we looked at. The first bias pattern we explored was the prove it again bias. And this is the idea that women in the workplace have to consistently prove themselves over and over again, prove that they are as competent, as qualified to do their job as their male colleagues. In India, 74% of women engineers reported experiencing this particular type of bias. 75% reported having to prove themselves over and over again to get the same level of recognition as their male colleagues. And 48% reported that they are often, in meetings, their ideas are being credited to others. What was really interesting about this particular study in India that we didn't really do in the US study is that we were able to, through regression analysis, tie these bias patterns and the existence of these bias patterns to specific workplace outcomes. And so, for example, with prove it again bias, an increase in prove it again bias was associated with decreases in feelings of belonging at work and a decrease in career satisfaction. So these are real outcomes that companies who are interested in retaining a diverse workforce should be interested in and paying attention to and trying to address the biases that are impacting their ability to retain women in the workforce. The second bias pattern that we looked at was tightrope bias. And this is a very prevalent bias in the US as well as in India. This is the idea that there is expected behaviors of women really falling in line with certain stereotypes. For example, for women, they don't want to be seen as too feminine. Usually if you're kind, friendly, agreeable, you may be well-liked, but not necessarily seen as leadership material. If you're seen as too masculine or showing certain masculine traits such as competitiveness, ambitiousness, you may be respected and seen as leadership material, but you may not necessarily be very well liked. So there's this tightrope, this balance that women are having to deal with in the workplace. And in India, 76% of women engineers reported feeling this particular type of bias. 45% believe that it's inappropriate for a woman to argue at work, even if it's business related. This compares to about 28% of male engineers in India. 45% of women feel pressured to play a traditionally feminine role at work. This is what we term the office housework, the taking notes in meetings, planning office parties, ordering supplies. So 45% of women in India feel this pressure to do this, very much in line with what we saw in the United States as well. And for an increase in tightrope bias that we saw, this was associated with decreases in women seeing a clear path for advancement for themselves in their company, as well as an increase in feelings of exclusion at work. The third pattern that we looked at was maternal wall bias. And this is the idea that as a parent, you may be seen as not as committed to your job anymore, not as competent in your work. And this can also affect men as well. But in India, regardless of gender, 40% of engineers believed that there's an attitude that mothers should work less because they have children at home to care for. And here are just a couple of quotes that were left on the survey from women engineers who completed it. One indicated that men believe that taking maternity leave is like taking a vacation for women. And another indicated that her boss resists letting her travel because she has young kids. So this particular type of bias in the workplace can have significant impact on women's career advancement. The fourth bias pattern we looked at was tug-of-war bias. And this is the idea that there's conflict between women at work. Now, we didn't see a lot of this particular bias in the US workforce. In fact, some of the responses or comments that we heard from the survey respondents was that there just weren't enough women to really feel that sort of conflict or competition in the workplace. But in India, we actually saw this play out. 74% indicated that more senior women engineers feel that more junior women engineers just don't understand what it takes to succeed as an engineer. And on the flip side of that, 63% of junior women engineers feel that senior women engineers aren't doing enough to try and change things or improve things for women coming up behind them. So this is just very, very briefly some highlights from our study in India. I encourage you, if you want to learn more about this particular study, the study we did in the US, or any of the other studies that we are conducting or have completed, to visit our research website, research.swe.org, to download those reports. We also have some data and statistics related to women and girls in engineering and in STEM in general on this site. You can also learn more about our research through our annual SWE magazine publication focused on the state of women in engineering and research associated with that. This is where we also print our annual literature review, which Peter and Peggy briefly provided an overview on. You can download that at our SWE website or purchase the beautiful hard copy, which it is an award-winning publication, which I'm really proud of, at Amazon. You can also look at our SWE Advanced site for professional development opportunities, because we do try to tie the research to some of the professional development offerings that we provide to our members. So now I'd like to welcome Dr. Laura Ettinger to the stage. She's the Associate Professor of History at Clarkson University. Dr. Ettinger will share preliminary findings from her research of women engineers' perspectives on the changes and challenges that they have experienced in the engineering profession since the 1970s. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I am going to talk with you about my team's research on the perspectives of women engineers who graduated from college in the 1970s, a time in US history when women's entry seemed most promising but failed to gain traction. You are going to hear a number of themes that have already been raised by the people on this stage this afternoon. I think these women have important perspectives on the challenges facing women engineers in the past and today. So engineering is, and as others have said, has long been the most male-dominated educational and occupational field. Yet in the 1970s, the numbers of women going into this field increased significantly. The percentage of women earning undergraduate degrees in engineering grew rapidly from less than 1% in 1970 to 9% in 1979. And this rapid increase was attributed to federal affirmative action requirements and, as Peggy said, a decrease in the number of men going into engineering. As historian Margaret Rossiter has explained, at this low point, most engineering deans concerned about their institution's survival began to do the unthinkable. They urged bright women whom they had formerly ignored or even scorned to apply. Alongside, they also did other initiatives to draw girls and women into engineering. Many expected that the number of women in engineering would continue to rise, but again, as Peggy indicated, the numbers plateaued, and the percentage of women earning undergraduate degrees in engineering has remained largely unchanged since around 2000. So this part of our research focused on the three research questions on the screen. How do the pioneering women engineers understand and explain the challenges they faced as women in a male-dominated field? To what extent do they think that the challenges facing women engineers have changed over time? And what advice do they have for today's young women who are interested in or already pursuing careers in engineering? So this work assesses a pivotal generation of pioneering American women engineers who, as I've already mentioned, graduated from college in the 1970s from an examination of both their professional and personal lives from childhood to the present day, in other words, from the late 1940s to the present. And no systematic study of these pioneering women currently exists. At the heart of this work is a nationwide survey which included 5 open-ended questions directed at women engineers who are retired or who are nearing the end of their careers. To be eligible for this survey, participants had to identify as a woman, They had to have grown up or worked in North America. They had to have earned an undergraduate degree in the 1970s, and they need to have majored in engineering or worked in as an engineer at some point in their career. 250 women who filled out the survey met these criteria, and of those 251 women, 163 said that they wished to be interviewed. And so far, I have conducted 47 of the 50 planned oral history interviews. This presentation focuses on the results of the survey. So just to give you a little bit of information about the demographics, you'll note on the screen that 93% of the survey respondents identified as white or Caucasian, reflecting the demographics of engineering in that era. About 82% of the respondents earned engineering degrees, and most of the others earned degrees in either math or science. 68% reported having biological or adopted children of their own, and another 10% reported having stepchildren only. And 38% of the respondents with biological or adopted children left the workforce for extended periods beyond maternity leaves to raise children. So why did these women choose engineering? The women's movement, affirmative action, and the Cold War emphasis on science and space as they were growing up, science and space exploration as they were growing up, created the atmosphere that encouraged them. What the women reported on the survey is that those who made this choice often had what would have been seen as masculine interests and aptitudes in math, science, and what we might call tinkering, as well as a desire to make a difference and be financially independent, and either explicit encouragement from, let's say, high school teachers, guidance counselors, parents, or sometimes a desire to prove others wrong. The women who completed the survey worked in many different kinds of jobs. Some worked for a short time as engineers and then left the paid workforce to raise families or to work instead in jobs that they saw as more family-friendly. A few respondents never worked as engineers, but instead worked as physicians or lawyers after they furthered their education in graduate school. Some rose up to high points in their organizations, while others made lateral moves for most of their careers, and still others were underemployed and felt that they never reached their full career potential. Many of the women talked about the satisfaction of engineering work, solving problems, making a difference, making good money, and being financially independent. So the challenges facing women engineers, which were mentioned most frequently by the respondents, can be divided into three themes. Number one, not getting respect. Number two, not fitting in. And number three, work-family balance. So the first one, the most frequently cited challenge was not getting respect from peers and supervisors. This was also cited as not being taken seriously, not being heard, not having people believe that women can be engineers, and having to prove yourself repeatedly. So one survey respondent explained, "The greatest challenge for me was continuing to believe in myself when all the messages I was getting was that I would never be taken seriously or promoted or given raises or even hired at the same rate as men who were clearly less qualified and not as smart as I was. That gets seriously annoying. Also, being asked to do that in a dress. That last part has changed." The second most frequently cited challenge was not fitting in. This was also expressed as feeling left out, isolation, being an oddity, being told you don't belong, and being left out of good old boys networking. And here's what one respondent said. "The biggest challenge is being reminded that women will never be considered or accepted as true engineers. We are women engineers. People don't refer to a man as a man engineer. He's an engineer. We are constantly reminded that we don't truly belong." The challenges of not getting respect and not fitting in reflected social interactions that produced gender inequalities in both the classroom and the workplace. In particular, women said that they are taken less seriously than men, even while performing as well or outperforming them, Simply by being women, participants were seen as less qualified and treated as outsiders because engineering was seen as inherently masculine. From subtle biases to overt discrimination, women were reminded that being a woman was seemingly at odds with being an engineer. And participants often questioned how and why their outward expression of gender, like how they dressed, their behavior, impacted their work as engineers. And here I'm going to talk a little bit about something that Roberta was also saying. In a 1992 study by Catalyst, a nonprofit organization using research to create better workplaces for women, one human resources professional explained how this worked. And again, this was 1992, and I suspect this will sound familiar. Women have to play a game on top of a game. So they not only have to understand organizational dynamics, but have to understand how to make the transition into a male organizational dynamic. A woman engineer had to learn how to sort of look like a man, but not really like a man, because if you get too close to that, you get too threatening, and if you get too far away, you're not a contender. That is, like their male counterparts, women engineers had to do work to understand the politics of their workplaces, but then as women, they had to do more work, complicated, nuanced work, to try to fit in with masculine workplace and cultural standards and to get respect from their peers and their bosses. Scholars call this extra layer of work that women engineers had and have to do identity work. The challenges of not getting respect and not fitting in are structural as much as they are interpersonal. That is, they signal a much larger structural problem in institutions like universities and workplaces, which don't create welcoming environments for women. Even the common use of the term women engineer denotes a structural problem, right? As the respondent whose comment on the screen noted, people don't refer to a man as a man engineer, he's an engineer. And that term, which I use as well, which we use as well, positions men as the reference group. The third most frequently cited challenge was work-family balance, and respondents explained that though men, of course, also have families, this issue does not affect them in the same way that it does women. Women also discussed the implications of this challenge, balancing work and family on their career trajectories. Some women noted that the available choices were constrained or decisions were imposed on them by supervisors. An example of this is the quotation on the screen. This respondent explained that her choices were constricted by her female supervisor's perception of Chinese American women in particular. And she said, "Being a member of the model minority, I have encountered a lot of subtle discrimination. When my mother got ill, my female boss demoted me so that you can take care of your mother. I didn't have a choice." The challenge of work-family balance can be viewed, once again, from the lens of interpersonal relationships. In their interactions with one another, women and men in heterosexual relationships often both assume that women will do more of the caregiving work and be more flexible about paid employment as compared to men. Male and female supervisors frequently make similar assumptions about female employees. Those assumptions help to limit women employees' career options. As this interpersonal approach to gender shows, though women appear to have many choices, work full-time outside the home, be a stay-at-home parent, combine work and family, engage in part-time work, those choices are often circumscribed by women's and men's interactions and assumptions. And once again, the challenge here, the challenge of work-family balance, is not just about interpersonal interactions and assumptions. It also, once again, has to do with structural problems, in this case, including the cultural norms about caregiving and lack of workplace supports and policies for parental or family leave. In particular, our workplaces are structured in ways that reward employees who have the ability to prioritize work above caregiving responsibilities or who don't have such responsibilities. And all of that adversely affects employees with caregiving responsibilities, which is a role disproportionately occupied by women. Likewise, the US remains the only industrialized country without a mandated maternity leave policy and has been very slow to adopt maternity or family leave policies. And this, along with a lack of adequate government policies surrounding childcare and flexible work hours to mitigate these issues, has created barriers for caregivers, resulting in workplaces that continue to be distinctly gendered. So one of the questions that we asked on this survey was, to what extent do you think the challenges for women engineers have changed over time? And the responses were interesting. The most frequent answer was a variation of progress is slow, as one woman put it. That while things have improved for women in engineering, many interpersonal and structural challenges continue, and some of those are more subtle. As one respondent put it, they're stealthier now. Some participants said that gender problems no longer exist, that gender is not a thing anymore. And according to several scholars, this response is typical of a number of women engineers and can be seen as an assimilation strategy. So many respondents enthusiastically advise young women interested in or already pursuing careers in engineering to go for it or do it. That was said over and over and over again on the survey, despite their acknowledgement of gender discrimination in the field. In their advice, the women often didn't mention any of the challenges. Sometimes, though, the advice noted the challenges and then advised young women to ignore the obstacles in order to persevere and succeed in the long run. And so here's what one woman advised. Be persistent about it and never give up. Having a stubborn streak also helps. This is still true. A woman has to be twice as good as a man to be considered half as good. And then she added, however, this is not difficult. Others stressed the importance of finding a supportive network and identifying both male and female mentors early on. Participants acknowledged extensive structural and interpersonal constraints, yet their advice to young women was often either gender neutral, like go for it, or stating that their advice applied to both young men and young women considering engineering, or that advice relied upon individual level solutions, often emphasizing perseverance, working hard, doing or finding what they loved in order to be successful as engineers. And for these women, advice reflected a belief in meritocracy, suggesting that hard work would provide the necessary tools for women to surmount any hurdles that might lie ahead. In some cases, women more explicitly advised that aspiring women engineers should ignore gender altogether in order to be successful or to find alternative workplaces if their current jobs are unsupportive. Such advice runs the risk of blaming individual women for their perceived failures without acknowledging that there may indeed be interpersonal and structural barriers to success beyond an individual's control. Similarly, advice to change places of employment ultimately doesn't challenge the problematic workplace culture. However, all of this is understandable. In order to operate in such a male-dominated space, the women likely had, and I would add still have, to find ways to persist in the moment where instantaneous change to workplace culture is unlikely. Likewise, advice like don't go looking for discrimination, which some participants said on the survey, may not indicate that participants believed that gender was irrelevant, but instead it may reflect the reality that too much attention to being a woman could jeopardize everything that these women had worked very hard to achieve. So individual level solutions allow ways for women to gain, to survive in the profession, right? To gain some control over their work environment and to persevere in the moment, all of which makes a lot of sense. Additionally, the firm resolve of many of the participants demonstrates admirable persistence, rooted in the belief that women can be successful in engineering, and in urging young women to own their strengths, to stay true to themselves, to keep on going, especially while acknowledging the likely interpersonal and structural challenges. Respondents, of course, were recognizing the potential of women engineers, something that aspiring women engineers are not always hearing. However, although individual level solutions might help some women to succeed, they won't help all women to do so, not because the women don't try, not because they're incapable, but because the interpersonal and structural challenges can sometimes be too great. So clearly here, our findings are suggesting that although the engineering landscape has changed for women over time, it's far from equitable. And to work toward the goal of greater gender inclusivity in engineering, we offer 4 primary recommendations here on the screen. The first, something that I know is discussed a lot here, is mentoring. The survey respondents cited the importance of finding supportive network and multiple male and female mentors. SWE and other engineering organizations have long advocated and promoted mentorship. And we recommend that engineering organizations create mentoring programs based on social science research and with appropriate training for mentors and mentees, which tap specifically into the experiences and perspectives of late career and retired women engineers. As evidenced by their very rich survey responses, pioneering women engineers have valuable experiences and wisdom to share, and they have a desire to do so. Today's young women in engineering, in a sense, are still pioneers, so learning from the women who came before them can demonstrate that the young women's experiences are neither irrelevant nor isolated incidents. The second recommendation is advocates and allies. Given the structural and interpersonal challenges that the participants identified, it's important not to focus on fixing the women, but rather on changing the culture. And our respondents said that often men and even fellow women do not realize the ways in which they contribute to the feeling of women being marginalized. Engineering educational programs and workplaces should provide opportunities for men who continue to make up the majority of these institutions to learn how to become effective advocates for and allies of women engineers. And there are recent examples from both industry and academia of what are called advocates and allies programs that institutions can turn to for this. A third recommendation is to take an interdisciplinary approach. Engineering has been trying, of course, for decades to move the numbers, right, to increase the number of women in the profession. We recommend taking an interdisciplinary approach to this problem, as well as to address the cultural challenges facing not just engineering, but many other professions, as evidenced by, for example, the Me Too campaign. Social scientists can provide an interdisciplinary framework to help dismantle the complex structural challenges that women have faced and continue to face in engineering and that may otherwise feel unsurmountable. And our fourth recommendation is empathy and action. The pioneers are generously telling us their powerful stories, and we recommend that their stories be used to create empathy and provoke necessary action. For the profession to become more inclusive and to realize its full potential, senior management in particular, most though not all of whom are male, must be willing to listen for and examine their own unconscious biases. In leading these discussions by example, both men and women in positions of influence will be more willing and able to create an environment in which discussions of unconscious biases focus on questioning stagnant institutional practices. And I've put up on the screen, again, my name and contact information, and I welcome the opportunity to speak to those of you who are more interested in this project. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laura. This summer, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine released a report from a study they conducted to explore the influence of sexual harassment in academia on the career advancement of women in the scientific, technical, and medical workforce. This report release is timely given the recent activity around Title IX, which affects women and girls studying and working in education, but also with a larger Me Too movement, which is influencing our educational institutions, our workplaces, and our government. We are fortunate to have one of the report contributors with us today. I would like to welcome Dr. Alice Agogino, the Roscoe and Elizabeth Hughes Professor of Mechanical Engineering at UC Berkeley, to discuss some of the findings and recommendations of the study.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here. By the way, I'm one of Laura's pioneers. I graduated in 1975 from University of New Mexico. There were no other women in my class in mechanical engineering, but there was one other woman in civil engineering and another in electrical engineering, and we started the SWE chapter at University of New Mexico. So our report on sexual harassment of women took over 2 years. It was a consensus study where we looked at other studies. We had 3 workshops. We had people that came in and testified. And we picked our title at the end after we looked at the results and our recommendations. And so the focus is on climate, culture, and consequences. And we included in our study all of the areas in the national academies. So it included sciences, engineering, and medicine. And that's the book, by the way. I have 1 copy if anyone wants to pick it up afterwards, and I have several copies of the highlights of the study. I want to thank our sponsors. The lead sponsor with the National Science Foundation. We were very fortunate to get professional societies, companies, and other government organizations to provide support for the study. The study was co-chaired by 2 members of the National Academy. Paula Johnson from Wellesley College. She was with the, what used to be called the Institute of Medicine, is now is the National Academy of Medicine. And Sheila Widnoff from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology is a member of the National Academy of Engineering. You may know her that she was the Secretary of the Air Force at one point. And then the other members of the committee were chosen because of their expertise in looking at sexual harassment, working in various fields of related study. This is maybe a little hard to read. It's the study statement of the task. One rule of the National Academy study is that it's a consensus study and the words are important. So I wanted to put the exact statement up there. But generally, the committee was charged with examining, 1, how prevalent sexual harassment was in academic science, engineering, and medicine. 2, the impacts it has on the recruitment, retention, and advancement of women in these fields. And 3, the policies, strategies, and practices for preventing and addressing sexual harassment. So maybe a little bit wordy here, but I'll try to highlight what we thought was most important out of the study, but I also want to remain true to the consensus study. Number 1 was there was a misunderstanding of what sexual harassment was overall, and how you ask the question or how you talk to people about it, you'll get different answers. And this is the formal definition of sexual harassment that includes 3 categories that we looked at: sexual coercion, unwanted sexual attraction, and gender harassment. It's part of a broader effect that includes gender difference altogether. And we had been spending a lot of time looking at implicit bias and what prevents women from moving forward in leadership or promotion, when at the same time we were getting this explicit discrimination in terms of sexual harassment, and decided to move a study forward on it. Sexual harassment on coercion is maybe sometimes called quid pro quo, where you, in order to keep your job or to get promoted, or you may even be fired if you don't have sex with a supervisor or something like that. But related to sexual coercion is unwanted sexual attention, which could come as, in terms of unwanted hugging, touching, stroking, kissing, and relentless pressure to go on dates with somebody, and sometimes can include sexual assault. And thus this kind of consensual coercion might, in addition to being a civil problem, could also be a criminal problem. Having said that, these are the least likely cases of sexual harassment. The most common case of sexual harassment is the put down and not the come on. Its most common form of sexual harassment is verbal and visual conduct that conveys hostility, objectification, exclusion, or second-class status about members of genders. Comments that we heard before in some of the reports were, a woman can't really be effective as an engineer. That's the most common form of sexual harassment. And it's important to note that sexual harassment is not limited to the individual, but also can affect the ambient environment, such as pornographic cartoons, lewd graffiti, sexual slurs that might be stared at in some public place, and a feeling that you don't belong, that you've walked into a men's locker room and you don't belong in that same room. And so it can create a hostile environment for everybody, including men and women that are in that room. So one way to look at it is this iceberg view. There's what gets a lot of press at the top with this explicit sexual harassment associated with sexual coercion. It's been in the news a lot. It's the first thing that comes to mind and is what most visible. But there's just a whole iceberg underneath it that is really equally problematic. The put down, not the come on. So as we move up, and it's really hard to read here, but this is where these other aspects of gender harassment occur, with the subtle comments that are sometimes made, or the continuing asking somebody out for a date, or the put downs that are 1,000 cuts that can have severe both psychological and physical damage. So here are just some of our findings, and then I'll go over our recommendations. Sexual harassing behavior can be either direct, so it's targeted towards individuals, or it can be ambient and infect a larger population. A general level of sexual harassment in an environment can be very harmful in both cases. Gender harassment is severe and occurs most frequently over a time and can result to the same level of negative professional psychological outcomes as isolated instances of sexual coercion. So one finding is that, unfortunately, sexual harassment is still pervasive even after all these women coming into the profession since the 1970s. The best available analyses, and it depends on how you ask the question, show that at least 50% of women faculty and staff in academia experience sexual harassment. And again, at universities, students are saying the same thing. Depending on how you ask the question or what the ambient climate is like, 20 to 50% of students in science and engineering and medicine experience sexual harassment from faculty and staff. And it's not clear that these numbers have changed over time. So here's another way to look at engineering within the bigger framework of sexual harassment in academia. We also looked at the numbers for non-STEM, science, engineering, and medicine, and we separated out gender harassment into two categories. The dark blue is a sexist hostility, and the gray is crude behavior. And we can see that the most frequent type of harassment experienced are those two that are associated with gender harassment. First, the sexist hostility, and then the crude behavior. And then next are the others that I've talked about. One thing that was really striking was the high level of sexual harassment in medicine, and again, probably because of great power differentials in medicine, but the second highest number was in engineering. And I'll go over some of the reasons why we think that is the case. So our recommendation, and thus the title of our report on sexual harassment, is that there is something we can do about it. Leaders in academic institutions and research and training sites have to pay attention to the greatest category of sexual harassment, including in addition to these other categories, and have increased attention to and enact policies that cover gender harassment as a means of identifying the most common form of sexual harassment and preventing this kind of behavior. And these findings lead to thinking about what are other issues and intersectionality issues associated with gender and sexual harassment as well. We found that women of color experience more harassment than white women, white men, and men of color do. And women of color often experience sexual harassment that includes racial harassment, and sometimes it's hard for them to tell which is which. Sexual and gender minority people experience more sexual harassment than heterosexual women do as well. And thus, we have to look at this intersectionality and how it influences the overall climate. One thing I found really interesting is that you can actually predict whether you have a climate for sexual harassment, and thus turning that around can make a big difference. The two characteristics most associated with higher rates of sexual harassment are A, male-dominated gender ratios in leadership. We can change that. B, an organizational climate that communicates tolerance of sexual harassment. We can change that as well. Organizational climate by far is the greatest predictor of the occurrence of sexual harassment, and ameliorating it is something we can do. It can prevent people from sexual harassing others, and there have been rigorous studies that have shown that if there is a permissive climate of sexual harassment, people prone to sexual harassment are more likely to act out. So the finding is the impact on the targets, the bystanders, and the entire research enterprise. Sexual harassment undermines women's professional educational attainment and mental and physical health. Women are harassed. The more that women are harassed, the more they report symptoms of depression, disordered eating, stress, anxiety, and physical complaints, headaches, exhaustion, sleep disruption. And in fact, some of these, 1 in 5, can lead to critical clinical criteria of major depressive disorder. 1 in 10 might be considered post-traumatic stress. So the impact can be quite severe. In other words, gender harassment can trigger greater physical problems as well. The cumulative effect of sexual harassment is significant damage to research integrity and a costly loss of talent in academic sciences and engineering and medicine. And it's very clear that sexual harassment has and can derail women's lives. While women faculty are sexually harassed, they find jobs less satisfying and more stressful. Many eventually drop out in one form or other. They may withdraw, they may not go to conferences that are male-dominated, and they may leave their institution. This has a severe effect on the research enterprise and the number of women that are in science, medicine, and engineering and academia. So I don't know, I did. So finding of the legal system, and I may have skipped something here. I think I did. Can I go backwards? Well, so in coping, that's okay. In coping with sexual harassment, the least common response is for women to not report. And we've heard this in the news. It is the least likely criminal activity or sexual activity that is it is the highest rate of underreporting. For many, this is due to an accurate perception that they may be experiencing retaliation or other negative outcomes associated with their professional and personal lives. So that gets to the legal system. There is a legal system to protect against sexual harassment, but that legal system is the minimum necessary needed to protect the institution and not the target. It is not an adequate mechanism to make the cultural changes that are needed. We need a system to change the culture and climate in higher education. It's required to prevent and effectively address all 3 forms of sexual harassment. And so in order to do that, we need to change the organization. And there are characteristics of a climate that will either promote sexual harassment or will help make it not happen. So a permissive climate towards sexual harassment includes the following characteristics that we need to turn around: a perceived risk to victims for reporting harassment, lack of sanctions against the offenders, and the perception that one's complaints will not be taken seriously. Again, these are all things we can do something about, and that leads to our recommendations. We had many recommendations, and we have a book of recommendations, but these are the top 4 because of limited time that I'll highlight. Number 1, we want to integrate values of diversity, inclusion, and respect into the policies and the procedures of any organization. This is the critical thing. Sexual harassment can happen when we do not do this, when we do not respect diversity and inclusion and respect. Number 2, we need to change the power dynamics in advisor-trainee relationships. Many of the aspects of sexual harassment are on vulnerable women that entire careers may be due to men who have positions of power over them and can change their lives. 3, we need to support targets of sexual harassment by providing alternative ways to assess support services, record information about an incident, and report an incident without fear of retaliation. We need to be more transparent about this and more help to the target. And 4, this improved transparency and accountability will demonstrate that institutions are investigating and holding people accountable. So with that, I'd like to just give a video.
As a country, we have woken up to the ways women's lives are impacted by sexual harassment. The time has come to focus on academic institutions, especially in male-dominated fields like science, engineering, and medicine. Together, we can do better by creating a climate that discourages all forms of sexual harassment, including sexual coercion, unwanted sexual attention, and gender harassment. Research shows that we must do more than attend occasional training sessions and review vague policies and procedures. Here is what we need to do. 1. Integrate values into the system. Policies and procedures must embody the institutional values of diversity, inclusion, and respect, especially for hiring, promotion, and tenure decision-making. 2. Change the power dynamics. With funding, research focus, and professional reputation wrapped up in a single advisor-trainee relationship, the potential for abuse is too high. Institutions need to diffuse these dependencies by encouraging advisor networks and provide independent funding so students and trainees have options. 3. Support targets of sexual harassment. Many women don't report sexual harassment because they fear it will hurt them in their careers, and it does. Institutions must do more to support targets by providing alternative ways to access support services, record information about an incident, and report an incident without fear of retaliation. 4. Improve transparency and accountability. While still respecting people's privacy, institutions need to make their communities aware of the consequences sexual harassers will face and demonstrate that the institution investigates incidents and holds people accountable. Now is the time for institutions to take action. We can prevent sexual harassment.
So there is something that we can do about sexual harassment, and the changes in climate, culture, and consequences will help address some of the other issues that were reported on earlier. I'd like to add one more thing about the role that professional societies can play. And as the Society of Women Engineers is a professional society, it should be included in the mix. We are finding out that government organizations are changing their policy hand in hand with some of the work we're doing with the national academies. The National Science Foundation, for instance, has a new policy that sexual harassers who have been found guilty at their university using their local standards have to have their activity and the consequences reported if there's been some action. National Institute of Health is reviewing this as well. But things societies can think about, because some of the sexual harassment actually happens at professional societies when young women are students who are away from the campus environment and maybe are even more vulnerable to predators. So number one, enacting new codes of conduct and new rules related specifically to conference attendance is something professional societies can do. Strengthening statements on sexual harassment, bullying, discrimination in professional societies, codes of conduct, and a few defining it as research misconduct because it is related to the research mission. 3, factoring a harassment-related professional misconduct into a scientific award decision, as well as even reconsidering their retention as a member of the professional society. 4, including sexual harassment and codes of ethics in investigating reports of sexual harassment. 5, requiring members to acknowledge in writing the professional society rules and codes of conduct related to sexual harassment during conference registration and during membership sign-up and renewal. I'm a member of the National Academy of Engineering, and it is considering such a policy as we speak. And 6, supporting and designing programs that prevent harassment and provide skills to intervene when someone is being harassed. So we can change this. It's about time. Thank you.
So thank you, everyone. I'm Karen Hording, Executive Director and CEO of the Society. And I think we've heard some really great information here today, but we do have some time that we want to open it up to the audience to ask a few questions. So I think we have volunteers out there who have handheld microphones. So if you would like to ask a question of any of our panelists, please just raise your hand and a volunteer will come over. And if you could just let us know when you're asking your question, which of our panelists you are directing that to. Thank you.
Okay. Oh, sorry. I actually was curious about statistics, and when you look at careers that women in engineering have, what you consider to be still working in engineering versus maybe not working in engineering. And specifically in my company, women are in a lot of technical marketing and sales roles that require engineering, but maybe wouldn't be the right box. So I'm just curious how the data is collected.
Maybe Peggy.
That's a really good question. And it often depends on who's collecting the data. So it's very easy to identify who's earning what degrees and count that. The Bureau of Labor Statistics and the National Science Foundation have somewhat different definitions of what constitutes engineering employment. So that's one of the things that you have to keep in mind when you look at different data sources. But the good thing about the Bureau of Labor Statistics is that it has a very structured way of collecting information about the workforce and has been doing it for a long time, so you can look at some comparisons over time. But there are people who move into management roles are more likely to be categorized in the management bucket than the technical bucket. So that's a very good thing to keep in mind when you're looking at those statistics.
Hi, I'm not really sure who should respond to this question, but is there any research on how women's silence and the lack of reporting has potentially impacted the perception of the severity of harassment, the impacts it has? Is there an acknowledgement for some of these companies that still foster a hostile environment that they are actually causing this damage?
Well, it really rarely gets to that stage because the current laws and in fact the implementation of Title IX is to be able to protect the institution, and too often what actually happens is covered up, somewhat like the Catholic Church with sexual harassment within the Catholic Church. And so it's that climate where victims feel they can't report, where they don't see any consequences to it happening and they observe it, whether they are a target themselves or not, and their fear of retaliation if they do report it. All of those are associated with a climate that would promote more sexual harassment for those who are predisposed. And apparently there are people, psychologically studies, where there are people that are predisposed for gender discrimination, sexism, and sexual harassment. But rarely does it ever get to the point that the sexual harassment is so strong that it shows up in a climate harassment case. But sometimes it does. And it affects many people. It affects the non-targets. So for instance, someone who has been sexually harassed may get a lot of attention, and others who do not feel that they're getting their job promotion because of it. And so it can get to a legal situation where, in fact, there are some other remedies that do happen.
And I'll add that we have very little data about what goes on in private employment. Mm-hmm. The National Academy of Studies looking primarily at higher education.
This last study did, yeah.
And we have insight into that because that's tied to federal funding. And so that gives some requirements for openness and some leverages for having change happen. That's a much different situation in private corporations. So there's very much less information available on those kinds of workplaces.
Do we have some other questions?
Yes, this is towards Peter. You were discussing, sorry, I have it written down, work-life balance and starting families, and I didn't know if there was any other information about other countries, especially those that have extended paid familial leave.
There is a lot of research on the effect of parental leave policies and work-family policies in other countries, and it's complicated. I mean, the kind of the most extreme case that gets discussed pretty widely is Scandinavia, where you have very liberal policies, and which are often actually gender neutral, that they're actually parental leave policies, so men and women can take advantage of them and this sort of thing. And pretty consistently, the findings have been that women are far more likely to make use of these policies than are men, and that there are still negative career consequences to doing that, both in terms of lost seniority, in terms of perceptions, in terms of income, and a whole series of things. So having a good work leave, family leave policy is not equal to solving the problem. I mean, there's general agreement that there's also, there's a cultural issue, that men have to agree that this is my thing too, and they don't, at least not yet.
I was on a study that looked at this as well, and I think Denmark stood out at me. It's maybe a necessary condition. It's needed for everyone.
Yes.
But if there isn't a good climate that they would work in, that may be drive and override everything else. So, I think Denmark doesn't have a high percentage of women in engineering, but they do have great social policies for childcare.
Mm-hmm.
I think we have time for one more question.
So I was wondering if SWE actually has some proactive program, like for example, if you report such an incident to your company and your company doesn't react, does SWE has some kind of pressure on the companies to work on that?
I mean, we don't have a formal program, but certainly as we work with our employer partners, those are the kinds of things we talk about with them. And much like Alice was sharing some of the best practices, so those are the things we do take forward and talk to them about. I mean, it's difficult to force them to do certain things, but I think the companies that do it well are the ones that will be successful from a business perspective. We talk a lot about it being a business imperative, and so I think the companies that we see embracing those changes and really looking at the systemic changes are the ones that will be successful. So I think with that, we will thank all of our panelists. So thank you to Roberta, Peggy, Peter, Laura, and Alice. Thank you for being here. Thank you.